Hello and most welcome to 1829 of the Heidegger series. We will today continue Francis E. Lin's article, Thinking as a Process. And we are currently at page 24. Last time we looked into whether it is possible that thinking is an auxiliary process. That is something that is questioned by Wittgenstein, given an example of a person speaking silently to himself while doing something. For instance, fixing things for his new tool, arranging them, and at the same time giving sounds, reactions, and the like. That sort of illustrates what is happening. Like, ouch, no, that wasn't the one. Why, perfect. Isn't that fantastic? The first time we hear him, and that was called the first timer, we could reach the conclusion that we are now hearing his thinking, or that that is his thinking. But if we hear him repeatedly, many times, it is very doubtful that you still would believe that he is thinking those things that he is uttering. Because how would it be that the uttering of these things coincide neatly and exactly with his thinking? That is most definitely doubtful. So under what circumstances can we say that the thinking is it's accurate, it is actually what is taking place? The thing happening, the original thought, if you like. I will now continue the read from page 24, fourth paragraph. The three examples in Zettel 100 and Zettel 137 all show that performing auxiliary activities, including speaking sentences, does not guarantee that the worker is thinking. With this understanding, we can comprehend Zettel 106 to 7 and RPP 1980B 228 much more easily. Consider Zettel 106 first. As I said above, if the worker intersperses his work with some auxiliary activities, and we could say that he thinks while working, especially when we see him working for the first time. But these visible activities are not to be identified with thinking. Because if they become mechanical, then the worker does not think while working. This is analogous to talking. As explained in section 2.2 above, if one talks, then normally we say that he also thinks. But talking is not thinking. Because one can talk without thinking. That is, for instance, if talking becomes mechanical after rehearsing the sentences for hundreds of times. Zettel 107 and RPP 1980B 288 explain what it means to say that the concept thinking is formed on the model of an imaginary activity. As explained above, both the first-timer and the repeater perform the same auxiliary activities when constructing the appliance. But the former thinks while the latter does not. It is then quite natural for us to think that the repeater merely performs those auxiliary activities mechanically, whereas the first-timer not only performs those auxiliary activities, but also performs an extra activity, which is thinking. We are tempted to think that if there were no thinking, those auxiliary activities would be mere mechanical procedures. We are led to think that thinking is an invisible stream which flows under those auxiliary activities, carrying and connecting all of them. That thinking is an auxiliary activity, is what we imagine, what we are tempted to think. So thinking is the imaginary auxiliary activity. Though the use of the word imaginary suggests that thinking is not really an auxiliary activity, Wittgenstein actually does not say that this in the remarks we have been examining in this subsection. Both Scheer and Hanfling take it for granted that for Wittgenstein, thinking is not an auxiliary activity, and that Wittgenstein makes it clear in these remarks. But this is not justified. Some work needs to be done in order to establish that thinking is not an invisible activity. I shall now investigate whether this can be done. There are close parallels between philosophical investigations 330 and settle 170. One can speak a sentence with thought and can also speak it without thought. Speaking the sentence by itself is not thinking, for it can be done mechanically. When one speaks the sentence with thought, it seems that there is another process, which is the thinking which accompanies the speaking. But Wittgenstein says, what constitutes thought here is not some process which has to accompany the words if they are not to be spoken without thought. The example of constructing an appliance is similar. It shows that the auxiliary activities by themselves are not the thinking. The first timer performs these auxiliary activities, but he thinks. So it seems that thinking is an invisible activity. That what constitutes thought here is not some invisible activity which has to accompany the auxiliary activities if they are not to be performed without thought. Recall Wittgenstein's method of showing that thinking is not a process accompanying speaking. Effectively, according to section 2.4 above, he let us consider all the processes that may accompany speaking, facial expression, body movement, imagery, etc. And then see that none of them is sufficient or necessary for thinking. Notice that the accompanying process just mentioned are all visible, but this method cannot work in the present case. Here, we are not trying to find the thinking among the visible auxiliary activities. We would fail to find them if we tried. Rather, we hypothesize that thinking is an invisible activity. The said method then cannot lead us to the conclusion that thinking is not an invisible activity. What about the method of family resemblance, which Wittgenstein uses to show that thinking is not a mental activity? In section 3.2 above, we saw that Wittgenstein shows that thinking is not a particular mental activity by pointing out that thinking is a family resemblance concept, so that there is no common feature among all cases of thinking. Now, can this method be applied to the present case to show that thinking is not an invisible activity? To show that thinking is a family resemblance concept, we need to observe the features, processes, or activities which are present in cases of thinking and see that they overlap and crisscross. Notice that the features must be visible in order for this method to work. But the present case is different. For we are here concerned with whether thinking is an invisible activity. The idea is that in every case of thinking, there's an invisible activity present. The family resemblance method cannot show us that this idea is wrong. In fact, all the methods we have examined so far in this paper rely on visible processes or activities. These methods cannot be used to show that thinking is not an invisible activity or a process. To sum up this subsection, in making those remarks concerning auxiliary activities, Wittgenstein does two things. First, he states explicitly that, although it is often the case that a person who thinks while working intersperses his work with auxiliary activities, these auxiliary activities do not constitute thinking. Without which those auxiliary activities would seem to be merely mechanical. Who is to say that there isn't such a hidden, invisible activity, without which those auxiliary activities would seem to be merely mechanical? Who is to say that there isn't such a hidden, invisible activity? Wittgenstein's remarks considered in this subsection do not tackle this problem, nor do other remarks by him we have seen in the previous sections and subsections. This is a very important point, which I shall discuss in the next section. Conclusions. Thinking is a very troublesome concept, influenced by the forms of our language. We tend to view thinking as a mental process or a mental activity. In general, Wittgenstein regards these views as being problematic. But it is characteristic of him to avoid making direct assertions. Rather, he often makes remarks with hedges or qualifications. This has caused difficulties for commentators to understand what he really wants to say. Consider the first idea that thinking is a mental activity. Wittgenstein does not say thinking is not a mental activity. Rather, he says it is misleading then to talk of thinking as of a mental activity. In section 3.2 above, I explained that Wittgenstein saying so is entirely justified. To say that thinking is a mental activity is fine if the aim is to distinguish thinking from bodily activities such as running and kicking. But it will lead us to grammatical illusions if thinking is meant to be a particular mental activity. But it is correct to say to talk of thinking as a mental activity is misleading. This is very useful for us to understand Wittgenstein's position on the idea that thinking is a mental process or activity. Consider the idea that thinking is a mental process. We do not find Wittgenstein saying thinking is not a mental process. Rather, he writes in philosophy, the comparison of thinking to a process that goes on in secret is misleading. This is very useful for us to understand Wittgenstein's position on the idea that thinking is a mental process or activity. Consider the idea that thinking is a mental process. We do not find Wittgenstein saying thinking is not a mental process. Rather, he writes, in philosophy, the comparison of thinking to a process that goes on in secret is a misleading one. In saying this, we appear to be speaking of a process in his brain. But what we are actually concerned with are his thoughts. But if by saying that thinking is a mental process, we mean a particular process in the mind-brain, then we shall be speaking nonsense. For there isn't a mind-brain process that can be identified with thinking. Similarly, one might say thinking is an incorporeal process if one were using this to distinguish the grammar of the word think from that of say the word eat. But saying so will be nonsense. If thinking is meant to be a particular mind-brain process, now consider the idea that thinking is an activity which has generated much dispute among commentators. Wittgenstein does not say thinking is not an activity, Rather, what he says are, one could say of the word thinking that it is not an activity word, and therefore thinking really cannot be compared to an activity properly. To say that thinking is an activity is unproblematic if we are talking about something that a person can do. For example, if we can give someone the order, think about it. But saying that it will be senseless if thinking is taken to be an independent activity, one that can be detached from all other activities. This is why thinking cannot be compared to an activity properly. It also explains why one could say that thinking is not an activity word. One does not need always to say this, but one could say it when dealing with the erroneous idea that thinking is an independent activity. I think that I have explained reasonably clearly Wittgenstein's seemingly equivocal remarks concerning the idea that thinking is a mental process or a mental activity. I have also explained quite clearly, I hope, why for Wittgenstein thinking is not a particular process or an independent activity or a particular mental activity. Wittgenstein tries to show all this through reminding us of the various cases in which we use the word thinking. But I want now to point out a problem with his grammatical investigation of thinking. As his remarks on the imaginary auxiliary activity show there's a temptation to regard thinking as an invisible activity, hidden beneath all the auxiliary activities that are visible, observable. Why can't thinking be such an invisible and hidden activity? Wittgenstein's remarks we have considered so far have not dealt with this problem. So from all of his remarks we have seen so far in this paper, he has not succeeded in establishing that thinking is not a particular process or an independent activity or a particular mental activity. No previous commentators seem to have realized this. In fact, if we think hard on this issue, we shall find that the temptation to regard thinking as an activity or process underneath the observable activities is very strong. This applies to a host of cases. In case of the constructing of an appliance, both the first timer and the repeater do the same things, yet the former thinks and the latter doesn't. There are other cases of contrast too. For instance, a person talking with thought versus another talking without thinking, and a person having a mental image and thinking versus another having a mental image and not thinking. In all these cases, the two persons do exactly the same visible things, but one thinks and the other doesn't. So, good question here. So, doesn't the first person do an extra but invisible thing? That is thinking. We have looked at various attempts at answering what thinking is. For instance, thinking is a series of images as talking as inner speech, as an accompanying process, and as a particular mental activity. And we have seen that none of these candidates can be identified with thinking. note that the things we have tried are all observable activities or processes. Even mental images are observable by the person who has them. We are by now clear that thinking cannot be found on this level. But can thinking be an activity process behind these visible experiences? Why can't it be true that in all cases of thinking there is an invisible activity process going on? In fact, Wittgenstein also encounters this problem when dealing with the concept understanding. We are trying to get hold of the mental process of understanding which seems to be hidden behind those coarser and therefore more readily visible accompaniments. But we do not succeed, or rather, it does not get as far as a real attempt. For even supposing I had found something that happened in all those cases of understanding, why should it be the understanding? And how can the process of understanding have been hidden when I said, now I understand because I understood? And if I say it is hidden, then how do I know what I have to look for? I am in a muddle. So we see here, it is almost impossible to stay away from the conclusion that thinking is a series of images, or that thinking is silent speech or low speech, not nearly audible, nearly not audible, or that thinking is a process that happens at the same time as we speak or do other activities. Wittgenstein thinks and finds these aspects to be troublesome, to be hard to conclude. And as he said in the last quote here, where can I find the thinking? And whereabouts should I be looking for this extra feature of reality? As said on page 27, to say that thinking is a mental activity is fine if the aim is to distinguish thinking from bodily activities such as running and kicking, but it will lead us to a grammatical illusion if thinking is meant to be a particular mental activity. So it would be inappropriate to assert thinking is not a mental activity. But it is correct to say to talk of thinking as a mental activity is misleading. This is very useful for us to understand Wittgenstein's position on the idea that thinking is a mental process or activity. And at the end paragraph on page 28, there is a very apt question. So one, the repeater, doesn't have the thought because it's mechanical, and the other one who does it the first time has the mental thing. But where does it reside, this mentality? And why is it gone in the second or the third example when he is mechanically repeating the words? How can it disappear? And to where does it disappear? How does it cease to exist? How how can it just all of a sudden no longer be there? And I think this is the major philosophical mistake or language mistake that is already present long before we start doing any physics or philosophy. And it has never ever been pointed out by any philosopher thinker before. But this is the hub. This is the hinge on which everything else of philosophy and physics is dependent, hanging on to. That is what makes Wittgenstein unique, not as a philosopher, but looking at this foundational feature, which becomes so problematic if we do not know about it, which none of us does really. Why, I say thank you very much for listening in. Have a very pleasant day, afternoon, morning, evening, whatever you are having. Bye bye for now.